So good evening, everybody. And first of all, I'd like to start again by thanking the helpline, which has made this evening possible. The helpline, again, is open for people from all over England. And indeed, if someone from around the world wants to call, they're also welcome to. The helpline is there to help anyone who might be struggling. It's anonymous. It's an anonymous service. The callers all remain anonymous. And to date, the helpline has helped many, many people who otherwise would not have been able to reach out. The number is 0161 826 3333. Currently, they are open from 10 o'clock on Sunday morning till 10 o'clock in the evening, Sunday till Thursday. So again, we'd like to thank them for sponsoring this evening. I'd like to just start the evening by recapping. Last week, I realized somebody asked a question at the end of the session, and I only answered part of it. And I've realized because of the amount of questions that we've had fed back to us that we didn't really fully answer the question. So I'd like to just first start by revisiting that question and answering the first half of the question, which I didn't give an adequate answer to at the end of the last week's session. So the question was, how would I know if my child is being abused and if Yiddishkeit is one of those things that could have caused trauma for my child? So I'm going to address the first part of the question, which I didn't answer last week, was how would I know if my child was abused? So the truth is that in essence, that's a shiur for itself, and it'd take a long time to fully go into the ins and outs of that. So I'll do my best to make it very, very quick and to try and answer that question. The reason why this question was asked was because we spoke a lot last week about the high rate of children that are abused in our community. We said 1 in 4. And the amount of children who are struggling report having suffered some sort of abuse. The truth is that we don't know. We might never know if our child is being abused. And really, it's not essential to know because it's not really relevant to how we would work with our child. When we have a child in crisis, we're going to work with it in a certain way. We're going to work with him or her in a certain way. And it's irrelevant if we know for sure that the child has been abused. One thing I know for sure is that when you're worried about a child, you need to seek expert advice. So many parents come to me and say, and everybody says that it's because of abuse. I've asked my child so many times if he's been abused or she's been abused. And they said, why would you ask me that? Of course I haven't been abused. And they tell me they haven't been abused because I've asked my child. And that is something which we should never do. We should never give our child the notion to feel that we feel you might have been abused without proper training. We need to, often they might not understand what abuse is. Second of all, they might feel that it wasn't abuse because they were involved and they had some sort of enjoyment and some sort of boost to their confidence or whatever it was. And it's really complicated for them. And even if they have a really open relationship with the parents, when it comes to something like abuse, they're very embarrassed, very ashamed, and they need to feel so secure to be able to open up about it. I've sat with many victims of abuse and I've sat with them while they've opened up, and it takes a long time. It's usually just as you're about to do something else, they just let something drop, let a bombshell drop. And they're not really going to open up about it when they're asked about it. So, and it also doesn't affect the fact of how we're going to deal with a child who's in crisis. So you might not know, and it's not important to know if your child has or hasn't been abused. What is important to know is if my child is in crisis. If my child is in crisis, we need to seek expert advice. If they're not in crisis, then they're probably not being abused anyway, and we don't need to worry about that. But when you go to an expert, they'll be able to tell you how to proceed. And eventually, if you have that relationship with your child, they will probably tell you if they have or haven't been abused. So I hope that puts to rest what that question was. And if there's more questions on that, we can revisit that next week. But for now, I'd just like to move on to tonight's session. But before we start with tonight's session, let's just quickly recap what we said last week. So last week, we wanted to put out of the way the worry and the fear that my child might go off the derech. And we worried that this thing of them going with OTD is something which stops us actually being able to enjoy our children, because we're always worried if he does something different from the norm, he's going off, or, there's something wrong with him. So, and in fact, we met some friends on Shabbos and they said to us, they listened to the lecture last week and they said that it used to be we were scared of our parents and now we're scared of our children. And that's what we tried to put to rest last week. We should not be scared of our children. Being scared of our children or their behaviors or what they might do stops us being able to enjoy those children. Let's remember that if a child is doing well and he's happy and he's successful, he's not going to throw that away, not for anything in the world. He's definitely not going to throw it away for a McDonald's sandwich or for something else like that. We said that taiva is not something which makes a child dysfunctional. If a child is dysfunctional, it's not because of taiva. Bali taiva, people who are following their desires are doing that and they're being successful. The world around us managed to turn up at work on Monday morning after indulging in all their desires over the weekend. And that's not what's making our children dysfunctional. It's not taiva. And third of all, the most important thing to remember is that only trauma or such a low self-esteem has the ability to cause and wreak such havoc in these children's lives, to make their lives go on a trajectory which they themselves don't know how to get out of. So we don't need to worry. No child is going to choose such a path. And if they do go along such a path, we have to remember it's something has happened. And if you're worried about their behavior, again, I implore you, get expert advice. Turn to people in the field who know what they're doing and get advice earlier rather than later. You might not be able to stop their journey, but you can be with them there during their journey. Okay, so let's move on to tonight's session, which is about enjoying our teenagers. Baruch Hashem, I had a lot of feedback over the last week, and one of the comments that I kept hearing, and I generally hear whenever anybody connects to anyone who has a mahalach with children who are struggling, they come across and say, oh, well, when it comes to our teenagers, the right thing to do is, what, like you say, no boundaries, just give them what they want, unconditional love. And that's not the truth. In fact, not only is it not the truth, it's the furthest thing away from the truth. Because of course, children need boundaries. No one's saying that children shouldn't have boundaries. No one's saying that we shouldn't give our children or our teenagers a safety net. Of course, they have to have boundaries because children don't thrive when they don't have boundaries. With a regular child, especially when they're young, we have boundaries which keep them safe, boundaries which are to do with their behaviors. As they grow into adolescence, those boundaries have to widen to encompass their growing abilities, to encompass their growing mindset. And if they're struggling teenagers, if they're in crisis, then that boundary sometimes has to be an all-encompassing boundary, a huge boundary of love, which is around the entire life of this child. Remember, when you've got a child in crisis, his emotional body has been so broken, there's bits of him everywhere. There's bits of him wherever he was shouted at or abused or told off, or all the bad memories are all dotted around everywhere. And we need to encircle all those different pieces. We need to make a huge boundary of love around that child without any internal boundaries. And sometimes that's the boundary that that child needs, a safety net all the way around him, so wide that he can't fall through that net, through that boundary. So again, boundaries are important. And a child, again, if you're a teenager and you're unsure how to place those boundaries, don't take a risk by trying to just put boundaries wherever you feel they're necessary. Hopefully tonight we'll be able to explain a little bit more on how to do chinuch, etc. properly. When it's a child in crisis, again, you need an expert to help you place that boundary of love all the way around that child, that he doesn't fall through. And of course, the principles that we're giving over tonight are just general principles, and sometimes they can be applied, and other times you need help by a Rav or a mentor or somebody who understands your child to be able to put those boundaries into place and to be able to put what we're discussing tonight into place. So let's move on with how to actually enjoy our adolescents, how to enjoy our teenagers. So there is a famous conductor whose name is originally English, actually. His name was Benjamin Zander, and he conducts the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. In 2008, he gave a TED Talk. TED Talks are inspirational talks, which I believe are given in America. I haven't seen them beginning over here, but they're online and people can access them. They're inspirational talks. And Benjamin Zander gave a TED Talk in 2008. And in it, he explained how he is a world-famous conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. And he'd been a conductor for 20 years, and it made him think. On all the posters, whenever the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra was running, he was the one who was on the face of the posters. He's on the front of the CDs, of whatever media they give out. Benjamin Zander is the face of it. And yet he was thinking to himself, I'm the only person of all those people on the stage who doesn't make a sound. He stands at the front waving his baton, but doesn't make a sound. And that set him thinking, for 20 years I've been doing this, yet I'm the only person on stage who doesn't make a sound, and I'm the most famous person. I'm the world-renowned person from the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, much more so than the musicians. What is it that gives me that right to be that powerful person, to be the face of the Philharmonic Orchestra, of so many people? And he answered, he said, my success and the reason why I have a right to be the face of the orchestra is because I have the power to make others powerful. It's up to me to make those on the stage powerful. And because I'm in that fortunate position to make them powerful, I need to ask myself, how do I know if I'm being successful? And he explained, when there's a shining light in their eyes, when their eyes are lit up and their eyes are shining, I know, says Benjamin Zander, that I'm being successful with them. And then I get to ask myself the question, if there's no light in their eyes, what can I do to make that light come back? What can I do to bring that light forth? And if I can't bring that light forth, then I have no right to be that conductor. That's an idea we'll explore a little bit more. But he carried on to say and explain further that he once was lucky enough to meet an Auschwitz survivor, one of the rare Auschwitz survivors, a lady who'd been through the terrible death camp of Auschwitz. This lady was a 15-year-old when she went to Auschwitz, and she was, after losing her parents had disappeared, she and her 8-year-old brother were put on the train to Auschwitz. And when it got towards the end of the journey, she noticed that her brother didn't have his shoes on. And like any good 15-year-old sister, she turns around to her brother and she says, how can you be so careless? Can you not even look after your things for a few minutes? As any 15-year-old older sister would say to their younger brother when they're looking after them. But unfortunately, this was the last thing that she ever said to her brother. Her brother never made it further. When she came out of Auschwitz, she survived. She made a vow to herself. She made a promise that I will never say anything that could not stand as the last thing that I ever say. She promised herself this would never happen again. All her interactions with people after that would always be with the thought, if this is the last thing that I'm going to say to this person, how would I feel? Would I be okay with that? Now, can we imagine living on such a level? Obviously, it's not something that we can do because Baruch Hashem, we never had to experience what she experienced. But let's try tapping into this for a moment. Imagine how different our relationships, our reactions would be. We meet so many people on a regular basis. Often we get upset with somebody. We get upset with someone in the shop. We get upset with an inconsiderate driver. And of course, if we look at our homes and we come home and we see our children and they've done something silly, imagine we had that in our mind. What I'm about to say to my child, what would I feel if it was the last thing that I ever said to my child? How would I say it? How would I want my child to remember me? How would I feel if I never had an opportunity to say something different to my child? And he went on to say, Benjamin Zander, that more than anything, it's our silence and our carefully chosen words that can build people, that can give us the possibility to be able to see into the potential of people by just being silent sometimes and carefully choosing those words. That can help us to help our children and help the other people in our lives to bring forth the light in their eyes and to help them shine more than ever. So that is in truth, what Benjamin Zander says, that is really something which is really, really powerful. As parents, it's our job to be the conductor of our children, to bring forth that light, to bring forth their potential, to see the shining light in their eyes. Now, often people say to me, very nice, so we should be all encompassing, etc. But what about chinuch? We all have a mitzvah from the Torah to be mechanech, to educate our children. So they're 100% right. There's certainly a mitzvah to educate our children. There's a mitzvah of chinuch, of education for every single parent to his children. But we'll see how that mitzvah actually pans out. And there's 3 points I'd like to mention. First of all, Reb Chaim Volozhin, who was a Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, he said that anyone who angers easily is potter. He's exempt from the mitzvah of chinuch. He does not have a mitzvah to educate his child because he gets angry easily. That's the first point that a person needs to remember. But obviously, by definition, a parent is an educator. So by law, he has to do something. He can't just ignore his children. He might be potter from telling them off or from doing chinuch things. But what should he do, says Reb Chaim Volozhin? He should set by example. By working on himself and setting an example, he's yotzer, he's fulfilled his mitzvah of chinuch, of educating his children. He has to set an example. And this is something which Reb Chaim Volozhin said so many years ago, but which is so true today, because there's nothing more true in our world today for a parent, for a parent to know. By setting an example for their children, there's nothing more that children want to look up to their parents, to have the appreciation from their parents, to have the acknowledgement from their parents. There's nothing more they want to hear from their parents, to have that warm and close relationship and to hear how proud their parents are of them. Which is a story that I heard Reb Zechariah Wallerstein says over, that he was once giving a beautiful shir on the connection between Yaakov and Yosef, which we won't go into now. But he finished the shir speaking about the connection between a father and a child and how much it makes a difference. And he said, when he finished giving the shir, a very, very wealthy individual came over to him, someone he knew actually, and he says to him, Zechariah, I want to tell you something. He goes, you know, I'm extremely wealthy. And my parents were Holocaust survivors. They lost everything. They lost their previous families. They lost their children. They lost everything in the war. And they both survived. They met each other in America. They got married, and I was their only child. But because they'd been through so much, they decided that or it was a subconscious decision. They didn't want to get close to me in case they were to lose me as well. It would be too much for them. So while I knew I had a safe, stable home, nevertheless, my parents never showed me any love. I didn't get hugs, I didn't get kisses, and they were very, very cold. They didn't give me those words of, go get it. They kept it very cold. I became very successful, and my mother, towards the end of her life, was on her deathbed, and she was very weak, and I was sitting with her in the hospital, and she takes my hand, and she says to me, Chaim, I'm so proud of you. He says to Rabbi Zachariah Wallerstein, there was one day in business where I made $100 million on one day. $100 million on one day, he turned over. I felt like I was king of the world. No one could touch me. I was so powerful. It's such a great feeling. But he said it was nothing compared to when my mother took my hand and said to me, Chaim, I'm proud of you. That's how much it means, a mother's or father's pride to their child. And that's what the children really want. And I've heard it so many times from children who are otherwise swearing about their parents and talking about how they don't care about their parents, they want their parents dead. And they even tell that sometimes to their parents. They say very, very nasty things to their parents because they're so close to them. But yet, in their weakest moments, when they're crying, when they're speaking about how much they've been through in life, they say, and all I wanted was my father to connect to me. All I wanted was my father to show me that he loves me. All I wanted was to have that relationship, to know that my parents truly love me. And that's what Chaim Volozhin is saying. If we have bad midas, which is natural for us as human beings, then we have to be mechanech by setting an example, by having that warm, close relationship, because that's truly what every child wants. That brings us on to point number 2 about being mechanech our children. We have to understand, what does chinuch actually mean? What does educating mean? Both in Lashon HaKodesh and in English, the word educate comes from the root of bringing forth. That's, if one looks it up, what educate means. It means to bring forth. It doesn't mean to teach. And that means parents, rebbeim, menalim, are all educators, not teachers. Today we don't have melamdim in our schools, we have mechanchim. For the whole topics, we have teachers. We have a science teacher, we have a maths teacher, we have an English teacher, because they are teaching a subject to our children. They're not bringing forth anything. They're not bringing forth any potential other than teaching a subject to our children. They're not called a maths educator or a science educator. But our rebbeim are not melamdim. And if they feel they're melamdim, that they're there merely to impart their words of wisdom to the children, then they need to be finding somewhere else to go. Because in the olden days, we had melamdim. Children were brought up and they had melamdim who taught them how to read, etc. But today we have mechanchim in our schools. People who are there to bring forth the best in our children. And usually that is done through teaching them Torah. Usually it's done by teaching our children the rich heritage of being a Yid, the beauty of the Torah, the beauty of the mitzvahs. And that's how we bring forth the best in our children. We make them proud to be a Yid. But sometimes, and halavaya it was rare, but unfortunately it's not so rare. Sometimes we have children who don't tap into that. Something's happened to them to switch off that light in their eyes. Sometimes they don't get switched on by learning just about our heritage. They have questions they want to ask, and that's fine. The Torah embraces asking questions. We should encourage our children to ask questions, no matter how bizarre that question might be. And our rebbeim, our schools are mechanchim. They're people who are bringing forth the best in our children. And if it's not working the Torah by just teaching them Torah, then we need to find another way to bring forth the best in them. But as parents, we also have the obligation not to be a melamed, a teacher. We are being a mechanech to our children. If we're being mechanech our children, if we're worried about the mitzvah in the Torah of being mechanech our children, that is the mitzvah, to bring forth the best in that child. Hashem's put us in a generation which no previous generation's ever seen before. Our children, like we said last week, would never be able to survive today's generation. And it's up to us as parents to bring forth the best in our child, regardless of what that mahalach takes. We have to focus and find out what's best for this child. And we see in the Torah something beautiful. This isn't something which is a modern day fad, something which is modern day educators and modern day schools and rabbanim say. This is something we find in the Torah. We find that Yitzchak Avinu, Yitzchak, who had 2 children, Yaakov and Esav. And the Torah tells us that Yitzchak oyeves Esav, Yitzchak loved Esav kitzayid befiv, because his hunting was in his mouth. That's the literal translation. There is Rashi that says that kitzayid befiv, he used to trap him with different halachic questions. But Pashup Shah is Yitzchak loved Esav kitzayid befiv. He liked his barbecues. Now Yitzchak was the the most Kaddish of all. Yitzchak was on the Mizbeach. He was a carbon to Hashem. He wasn't allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. Yet he loved his son Esav, who was a murderer, because Gitzayid Befiv, because he liked his barbecue. Esav would come home and say, Dad, I've got a new recipe for steak, rare, Wagyu steak, whatever it is. And Yitzchak would say, nice, Esav. Let's see how it is. Come on, let's cook it up, see how it goes. And I once heard from somebody speaking on a Gouda convention that if you have 10 sons and 9 of them are big worldwide Rosh Hashivas or Rosh Kolelim or successful lawyers or whatever it is, and one of them's a biker, pull out your Harley Davidson and go biking with him, or pull out at least a book on Harley Davidson so you understand what your son's on about. And this is exactly what Yitzchak did. He shared Esav's love of hunting to have that connection with Esav. And that led to something even further. We're told by the Mefarshim, Esav had a son called Eliphaz. Eliphaz was an absolute lowlife. If one looks in the parashas, one knows why he's a lowlife. And he was actually the father of Amalek. Eliphaz grew up on the lap of Yitzchak. Now Yitzchak, today tzaddikim can see through people. They can see through their faces. They can see where a person's up to. And of course, Kal v'chomer, Yitzchak could see who Eliphaz was. Yitzchak knew who Eliphaz was. He was someone with Ruach HaKodesh. Yet Eliphaz grew up in Yitzchak's lap. Yitzchak looked after his grandson Eliphaz. Now, fast forward many years, Yaakov steals the Bechor from Esav. Esav swears to kill Yaakov, and Yaakov has to run away. Esav calls in his son Eliphaz, who's a lowlife, a person with zero morals, and says to Eliphaz, I want you to go and chase after Yaakov, I want you to kill him. And in one mitzvah in Esav's house, which was kept to the utmost, and that was the mitzvah of Kibbud Av V'Em. Nobody disobeyed a father. Esav did the mitzvah of Kibbud Av V'Em to his parents to the highest degree. And Kal v'chomer, Eliphaz had to listen to his father to the highest degree, especially when it came to murder. This was something they were good at. No morals whatsoever. He goes and chases after his uncle Yaakov. He finds Yaakov and he says to him, hi, Uncle Jake, I've got to kill you. Yaakov Avinu turns around to him and says to him, okay, Eliphaz, I get you. Your father's told you to kill me. But listen, you know the Gemara says, Ani chashav kameis, a poor person is considered dead. So let me give you all my money. I'll be dead. I'll be considered dead. You can then go and tell your dad, you've killed me. Eliphaz says, deal done. I'll go home. You're a poor man. I'll go home and I'll tell Esav that I've killed you. Seriously? Eliphaz had no morals. Why should he care about killing Yaakov? And not only that, but why he's going to listen to this Lomdestat that Yaakov has told him about Ani chashav kameis, a poor person is considered dead. Why would Eliphaz even go down that road? And the answer is because he grew up b'cheiko shel Yitzchak. At the end of the day, it was his grandfather who brought him up. And because of that love that his grandfather had shown to him, there was no way that he could now go and kill Yaakov. That's what stopped him. And indeed, that's why we're around today. Because Yitzchak showed love to his grandson, Eliphaz. He showed love to his son who only knew about murder, about hunting, about different barbecues. That's what he knew about. And Yitzchak related to him on that level, even though Yitzchak was nowhere there. Because that's how we need to connect to our children. We need to connect with whatever that talks to them. And that's why Eliphaz didn't kill Yaakov, and that's why Yaakov was able to have the Shavatim, and that's why Klal Yisrael is around today. So that's a point number 2, that we have to know Mechinuch means to bring out the best, bring forth the best in our child, however that is. Hopefully, it's going to be through teaching them Torah, through learning with them, but if that isn't working, we have to find the other way to turn that light on in their eyes. And third of all, before we tell off, before we rebuke our children, before we mechanech our children, we have to know how do we tell off a child. And for that, again, we have to look to the Torah, which is our book of life, our way of life, it's our laws, how we conduct ourselves. And if we look in the Torah, we find Moshe Rabbeinu, at the end of his life, starts to tell Klal Yisrael off, starts to tell Bnei Yisrael off for everything they've done wrong in the Midbar over the last 40 years, all the times that they tested Hashem. And Rashi comments in the beginning of Devarim, Pasuk Gimel, Rashi comments, where did Moshe Rabbeinu know to tell the Bnei Yisrael off just before he was about to die? And Rashi answers, he learned it from Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu's wife, Rachel, dies. Yaakov Avinu then goes and moves his bed, instead of, obviously, his wife Rachel's no longer alive, he moves his bed into Rachel's maidservant, his other wife, his secondary wife's tent, the tent of Bilhah. Reuven's the oldest son of Yaakov, the son of Leah, gets very upset. It's a bit of a slight to his mother, who was one of the main wives of Yaakov Avinu. And he goes and removes Yaakov's bed from the tent of Bilhah and puts it into his mother's tent, Leah. He stands up for his mother's covet. He does something terrible. The Shekhinah, Hashem, was resting on the bed of the Tzaddik Yaakov, and Reuven went and got involved in something which he had no right to get involved. Yaakov doesn't say a word. It's a terrible Avera for which Reuven is going to get later punished, that he's going to lose the Bechor, the right to the firstborn, to serve in the Beis HaMikdash because he did this Avera. Yet Yaakov doesn't say a word. Not that day, not the next day, and not the next month, and not the next year. 45 years later, Yaakov's lying on his deathbed, and he says, Reuven Beni, my beloved son Reuven, I'm telling you off now for what you did wrong. And if you want to know why I didn't tell you off earlier, was Kadesh Le Tanicheni. I was worried that you would leave me, and you'd go and join Esav, my brother. I was scared you would go off the derech. I was scared you'd go and join Esav if I were to tell you off. And therefore I waited 45 years. You should know I'm telling you off from a place of love and not from a place of anger. And that, says Rashi, is where Moshe Rabbeinu learned to tell of Klal Yisrael just before he was about to die. And indeed Yeshua told of Klal Yisrael just before he was about to die. Now, obviously, we are not on that level that we can withhold ourselves always. Although I have heard stories about Rosh Shlomo Freifeld, Rosh Hashiva, and Shayashov, who would refrain from telling off a bacha for 6 months. I've tried putting that off for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and it works. When you put it off telling a bacha, usually you don't end up telling him off. So, but generally, it's so hard to put off telling somebody, especially if we're upset about something. Yet, we need to ask ourselves a few questions. We need to ask ourselves, are we going to be better at telling off our children than Yaakov Avinu would have been telling off his son, Reuven? And if we are going to be able to give a better Mussar Drasha, let's say we have a better relationship with our children than, let's say, Chas v'shalom, than Yaakov had with his son Reuven. Is our child on a higher level and a better level than Reuven was in those days? Reuven was the first of the Shvatim. We can't even imagine who the Shvatim were. So is our son going to be more receptive than Reuven would have been to his father Yaakov? And let's say the answer to those two questions in your mind are yes. You can tell off better than Yaakov Avinu. And our children are better, more receptive than Reuven would have been to his father Yaakov. But then we have a third problem. Yaakov was worried his son would go and join Esav. How much more so do we need to be worried if we're telling off our children in the wrong way that they're going to go and join the Esav of today? What's going on in the streets out there, in the world out there, there is so much acceptance. If we don't accept our children and we're not relevant to them, they will go immediately outside and find someone who finds what they find funny. What they find interesting, they'll find interesting. There'll be people out there who will make them feel so warm and so accepted. And if we're going to tell them off and that's going to push them, we should be worried, says Rashi. We should be worried, like Yaakov Avinu, they might leave us and go and join Esav. So we really need to be careful when we remember that mitzvah of chinuch. Yes, Hashem's given us a mitzvah of chinuch, but that mitzvah of chinuch comes if we're worked on our midas. That mitzvah of chinuch comes by bringing out the best in our child. And that mitzvah of chinuch isn't about rebuking our children. It's about bringing forth the best in them. Are there any questions on what we've said so far? Okay, so we'll carry on a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, there is a question about telling off a child. If you're waiting to tell them off, because I have tried that, and especially with, I know we talked about young teenagers now, with younger children, they don't remember what they did. So if you're waiting like too long, they've forgotten what they did and they don't know what you're talking about when you say, you know, that wasn't okay. They have no clue because they've forgotten. And with the teenagers, it's how long to wait, or?
It's a good question. So I would say that obviously we don't always get it right, but we definitely can't be angry with them or upset about the incident that happened when we tell them off. So we need to wait long enough to be able to settle ourselves and be okay with what went on, and be able to show them, point out what it was that might not have been correct. We can even remind them of the incident, and they might say, I don't remember. But say, yeah, this was the incident. This is how maybe one should look at it. Maybe encourage them how we can look at it for the future. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. So we've just spoken about, I've seen a question come up. I'll answer that towards the end if that's okay. Okay, so we'll move on a little bit. Okay, so perhaps one of the most difficult questions when it comes as well to enjoying our teenagers is because of this burden of being mechanech. The way to enjoy life with them, We feel we have to put them right. We feel we have to put them in their place. So we need to look at one of the perhaps most difficult questions when it comes to being mechanech our children, and that is, how high does discipline come on our agenda of being mechanech our children, of educating our children? Discipline means how much are we controlling their behavior through consequences. Now, obviously, when a child's young, that's something that might work with them. They might understand with their small, younger mind. They understand consequences, and that's how they learn to behave themselves and what's right and what's wrong. But when we come to our teenagers, when we come to our adolescents, when they're no longer so receptive to the consequences that we might want to enforce on them, how much is that coming in? How much are the consequences coming in? And if they are coming in, are they coming in because we want them to behave in a certain way? Is it because we want the externals to look good? Or is it truly because we want to turn that light back on in their eyes? So with chinuch, it's got to be, especially when it comes to the adolescents, specifically when it comes to the adolescents, that it's got to be inspiring, and it's got to be setting the example for our children. Trying to control our children, trying to control their behaviors, and trying to force them to behave in a certain way, it might work in the very, very short term, especially when they've hit their teenage years. We might still be able to control them for a year or two, but in the long term, it will backfire. Because whatever we've tried to control them with, well, as soon as they're out of our control, they'll be off, and they'll be off to wherever they want, and they'll love the freedom so much that it wouldn't have helped them grow at all. So while for the short-term control will help, but it will not help in the long term. And when it comes to chinuch, we've got to be thinking about the future. Shlomo Wolbe, who was a worldwide mashgiach zecher tzaddik livracha, would speak so much about how to treat each child as an individual. Back in those days when OTD wasn't something which was common, when struggling children wasn't as common as it is today. And he would speak so much about it. And as we'll see soon, he didn't just preach about it, he actually practiced what he said. He was one of the gedolim, and we can learn a lot from what he tells us. He says that parents often think they're acting in a way which is educational, but in truth, it doesn't have the slightest connection. He goes, we sometimes use this banner of chinuch, and we hold up this banner, and that allows us to behave in certain ways, which if we would see other adults behaving in those ways, we'd be shocked and horrified. Yet, we justify using those ways, those midas, and using those traits, those same traits on our children. We see people, it says Rosh Hashanah, he sees people who use jealousy, who use honor searching, they're looking for their covet, and anger. Things which if we'd see other people doing on the streets, we saw people running after covet, we'd be quick to comment on it. If we saw or we knew somebody who was a jealous person, we'd be very quick to put them down. And of course, if we see someone lose their rag, then of course that's also something which isn't acceptable. But yet people seem to find it okay behind the banner of chinuch, says Rosh Hashanah. And he explains, exercise full control over their child, and they honor in the name of Hashem, in the name of Yiddishkeit, and promote the right to control their child and aspect of the changes, all in the name of Hashem. Says Rosh Hashanah, a person's got to be so careful about that. When it comes to jealousy, he explains, often a father or a mother goes out and she sees her neighbor's child behaving so nicely, bringing in the shopping and cleaning up or whatever it is, and she's jealous. Why can't my child behave like that? A father goes to shul and he sees somebody else's child always there on time. My child turns up late. Davening so long and his Shemay Neshes take forever and he's not looking around the shul, and my child can't sit still for 2 minutes. Another child sits next to his father. My child doesn't sit next to my father. So it doesn't sit next to me. That, says Rav Shlomo Wolbe, is jealousy. That is nothing to do with chinuch. And if we go then and mechanech our child, we're educating our child, no, I want you to do this because it comes from a source of jealousy, that's not chinuch, says Rav Shlomo Wolbe. Jealousy is a bad trait. It's a bad midah, and we have to get rid of it. The same thing with honor searching. We want our children sometimes to behave in a certain way, to be polite, because then people compliment us, oh, your children are so polite. We want our children to dress in a certain way. Look how refined their daughter dresses. Look how refined. Look what a good yeshiva bacher their son looks like. And we want our children to sometimes dress in certain ways because we want those compliments from our neighbors. We want people to think, wow, their son is such a good yeshiva bacher. Their son is such a good guy. Look how refined and edel he is. And that, says Rav Shlomo Wolbe, is something that's running after covet. That's running after covet, and that isn't okay. That's nothing to do with chinuch. And he goes in anger. When we come home and we ask our child to do something and they don't listen to us, says Rav Shlomo Wolbe, if we get angry because of something that they don't do when we've asked them to do it, that's also not chinuch. That's just anger. And we need to work on those character traits, says Rav Shlomo Wolbe. And he speaks very, very strongly about not hiding behind this educational banner. Now, it's important to know that, says Rav Shlomo, that we have to act first and foremost with their interests in mind. If we're acting with their interests, then in the long term, we will reap the external benefits as well. Rav Shlomo Wolbe has a son who lives in America. As far as I'm aware, he's a Rav, he's a mentor, he's a psychotherapist as far as I'm aware. And he, when he was a teenager, when he was young, he was a very difficult child. And I'd said this over, and I actually heard from somebody things were a bit different. I said this over when I was speaking, and somebody came to tell me they were in yeshiva at the time of the following story. Rav Shlomo Wolbe's son wanted to join the Israeli army. Now, Rav Shlomo Wolbe, we have to understand, was one of the Gedolim in the world, one of the greatest Jewish people in the yeshiva world at the time. And he encouraged his son to go and join the Israeli army. And his son went and he joined the IAF, the Israeli Air Force, and he would come back to Be'er Yaakov, where his father was the mashgiach in the yeshiva. And he would come back when he had leave, he would come back home and he'd come to the Beis HaMedrash and he'd stand at the back of the Beis HaMedrash in his army uniform with his beret on his head, his gun slung over his back. And Rav Shlomo, he relates how his father would run to the back of the Beis HaMedrash, bring his son all the way to the front to stand right next to him on the Overnon, stand right next to him on the Mizrach wall in the shul. And he'd said how his father would just look at him and just stand there looking at him with such pride. I have the best son in the world. His son felt, I could feel the love oozing out of his eyes. I said this over once, and somebody came to tell me that they were in yeshiva, and they remember a story which happened with Rav Shlomo Wolbe, which has now been made into a video, actually, a sweet video. Rav Shlomo Wolbe's daughter got engaged, and in those times, it was a minhag, or at least in Be'er Yaakov, that the chassan would come for a Shabbos. And then yeshiva was invited for Shabbos meal at Rav Shlomo Wolbe's house, together with the chassan, together with the new son-in-law, the future son-in-law. They were all sitting down to the meal, and suddenly, in the middle of the meal, ding-a-ling-a-ling, Israeli style. I don't know if any of you, when you live in Israel and an Israeli kid knocks on your door, it's knock, knock, knock until somebody answers. They don't just knock politely and then wait. It's knock, knock, knock until somebody answers. Rav Shlomo Wolbe was in the middle of the Shabbos meal, and in Be'er Yaakov, who was ringing doorbells? The doorbell rings, 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 rings. Rav Shlomo Wolbe goes to the door. They open the door, and in walks, in front of everybody, his son, in an open t-shirt, in shorts, with cigarettes and car keys in his hand. Now let's picture for a moment. Imagine we have our future son-in-law, or a friend even, round at our house, and around our Friday night table, and suddenly a child's phone rings in his pocket. Let's just imagine what our reaction would be for a moment. How dare you embarrass us like that? If you want to be Mechalel Shabbos, do it in your own room. Can you imagine what our reaction would be? And here was the Gadol, one of the Gedolim of Klal Yisrael. His son walks in front of everybody, rings the doorbell in the most brazen attitude, and embarrasses his father in the most humiliating way. Rav Shlomo opens up his arms and gives his son a huge hug. I'm so happy you made it. It wasn't the same without you. I'm so glad you came. And he goes and sits him down next to the chassan, and in between him and the chassan, and he tells his future son-in-law, this is my son. He's such a talented young man. You're going to get along really, really well. I want you to be friends. And he tells his wife, bring in the meal from the start. And the boy says, that Rav Shlomo Wolbe's son says later in his life, I couldn't walk out of there with my cigarettes and car keys. I felt so close to my father. And today, he's a very successful person in America because of his father's love. So as we said, his father... We have to look at the long term rather than the short term. And that's something which Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner described Yeshiva. Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, described yeshivas as being factories. He says yeshiva is a factory, not a showroom. He explained that a factory isn't focused on the aesthetically pleasing factors. A factory is a messy place. It can often be dirty, it can often be messy, it can be noisy, and it can be something which isn't nice and pleasing. It's not something which is beautiful, because the focus and the concentration is on making something of high quality. On the other side, there's such a thing called a showroom. And in the showroom, they're not worried about the quality, but they're more worried about how good things look. So that's what yeshivas have to do. Yeshivas have to concentrate, says Rabbi Yitzchak Kotner, not on how things look externally right now. And if yeshivas can't be worried about the people poking their noses in and looking at the outsiders poking their noses in and looking at how wonderful things look on the outside right now and see what they see in front of their eyes. In fact, I had a beautiful story about David Trenk. Unbelievable. There's a book coming out about David Trenk, who was a mashgiach for many years in yeshiva in America. He once got a call from somebody on a bus who'd seen two of his bachurim. And he said to David Trenk, you know, your boys, I think two of them are hiding a mini TV in their room. I heard them talking on the bus. So David Trenk says to them, did you talk to them in learning? Did you ask them what they were learning? So they said, no, they didn't. So David Trenk turns around to them and he says to them, you should know that you never saw my boys at all. You didn't talk to them in learning. You just poked your nose in from the outside and you think you know who my boys are. And this is Rabbi Yitzchak Kotner saying, yeshivas are factories. They've got to focus on what's good. They've got to focus on the long-term plan, on turning out a quality product. They cannot focus on the showroom product. And the same applies to being parents. We've got to be clever enough to be focused on our child's internal development, on bringing out a quality product and not get carried away on the external imperfections that our child is showing today. And in order to build happy and successful children, sometimes we have to put up with the noise and the disarray of a factory. Sometimes things aren't masudah. They're not in order when they're on a factory floor. It's noisy, it's messy, it's busy, and it's difficult. And it's not looking good when they're in a factory. But if we want to bring out a quality product, we won't have a showroom-like production role. But of course, we sometimes do need to pull out a policeman badge, but that can't be the image that our children have of us. It can't be that's how they relate to us, as being the disciplinarian. We have to have that open relationship with them. For about 10 years, to build that close relationship, that warm, close relationship with them, which will stand through the turbulent teenage years. So, there's one more thing that I'd like to point out before I finish off with a story which I think brings out something amazing. So there's also something else which sometimes gets in the way. So just recapping now, we've got to remember that our children, everything we do can't be under a banner of chinuch. It can't be under the banner that we can get angry with our children, we can punish our children, we can force our children to do things we don't want them to do, they don't want to do, is because all in the name of chinuch. We can't do that. Chinuch is something beautiful. And it's got to bring out the best in them. And the same is true for Torah and mitzvahs. It's so easy to get carried away with trying to force on our children a certain way of keeping the Torah, a certain way of keeping the mitzvahs, a certain way of davening to Hashem. We might want them to daven the same way that we daven, but for them, it might be better for them to connect to Hashem by davening in their own words to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rambam says the most ikka of davening is by doing hisbodedus, an hour of talking to Hashem a day. And that might work better for a child to talk to Hashem in his own words till he's mature enough, until he finds meaning in the printed word in the Siddur. And often, we like to give kiyum mitzvahs to our children. We like to ask our children to fulfill mitzvahs in the way that we do them, perhaps sometimes with extra churmas, which doesn't necessarily talk to them. And sometimes that turns them away from the beauty of Yiddishkeit. Yiddishkeit and the mitzvahs are something which is so beautiful that the Gemara talks about the different fruits which might be okay for what the Torah meant to use for an esrog. And the Torah says there's a certain fruit which has all the qualifications of an esrog, except, says the Gemara, it's uncomfortable to hold in your hand. And says the Chazal, our Rabbanim say that cannot be an esrog simply because it's too uncomfortable to hold. It cannot be what Hashem meant. It cannot be Hashem wanted us to have something which is uncomfortable, because the ways of the Torah are beautiful, they're smooth, and there's something special. So we need to add something into, especially for our teenagers, something which is special to all our mitzvahs. And it's something which I like to use as called the colored candle syndrome. We know that in the Second World War, many parents had to entrust their children to their Gentile neighbors. And often these children ended up in monasteries or in nunneries or were hidden away by the church. And there were many activists who, after the war, went searching for these children. Sometimes they could come into a place and they could shout out Shema Yisrael, and the children who'd forgotten that they were Jewish would remember this Shema Yisrael because it was the thing that their mother used to whisper in their ear before they went to sleep at night. But there were other children who didn't come from such religious homes, didn't hear Shema Yisrael, but there were other customs from home that they remembered. They remembered the colored candles on Hanukkah, the stories about the children who remembered choosing the colored candles on the festival of Hanukkah. Now, we need to do that with our mitzvahs as well. We need to bring in beauty to our mitzvahs that the children really feel, especially the teenagers, they really feel, oh, I'm looking forward to that Yom Tov. I'm looking forward to that Shabbos. if our Pesach is all about the stress of the cleaning, the stress of getting rid of the chametz, the stress of all the chumras, which are very, very important, and we definitely should not belittle the chumras at all, but it cannot overtake the beauty of Yom Tov for them. Used to so much luxury in their lives because that's where the world is. We have such a shefa, such an abundance that Kadosh Baruch Hu has given to us. We can't turn around to them and say, we're going to take all that away over Pesach, because then they'll turn around and say, I hate Pesach. We've got to make Pesach something special. Of course, if they can want to use those chumras and they want to live to that, of course we should. But if that's affecting the way they're enjoying Yom Tov, we need to concentrate on the main part. That in West Ham used to say to me, here in Manchester, that Baruch Hashem, we have so much frumkeit, but very little Yiddishkeit. People are concentrating on the externals more than they're concentrating on the main part of what's important. When it comes to Shabbos, if all a child knows is about the stress about laying the table just before Shabbos comes in, if all a child knows about his father's long divrei Torah at the meal, he had a child doesn't sometimes that children turn around and say, I hate Shabbos. Of course, if your child loves getting involved and hearing your touch on the parasha, hearing what you want to say in your Devar Torah, he likes discussing that with you, then that is brilliant. Your child will look forward to that. But if he's not looking forward to that, we have to steer away and find a colored candle to give to him for Shabbos or give to her for Shabbos. I once told a father it was a very serious case where the children were really struggling with the Shabbos meal. And I advised the father not to give divrei Torah. They all had to be ramrod still during the father's Devar Torah. And the father went and complained to his Rav, who's a very chashuv Rav in London. And the Rav, first of all, said I was quite right in saying that. But more than that, he said, my children have never heard a Devar Torah at my Shabbos table. And the father looked at him, what? And the Rav didn't explain more. But I spoke to the Rav afterwards. Of course, the children never heard the Devar Torah, because the table was talking about the parasha in a way which related to the children. It wasn't about the father giving over something that he'd read in a pamphlet in shul just before he came home. It wasn't about the father being able to give over what he wanted to give over. It was about connecting with those children. And actually, when I was preparing this, it reminded me, many, many years ago, I was staying by my auntie, who was a neighbor of Dayan Berkovitz, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. And I was there for Shalosh Shudas because I was friendly with Dayan Berkovitz's son. And I remember it was Parshas Nosai, and Dayan Berkovitz was telling over the story of the Haftorah. He was telling over the story of Shimshon HaGibbo. And I remember to this day how he was saying it over in such a beautiful, in such an unbelievable way that it stays with me even many, many, at least probably 30 years later. That's what we need to give over to our children. Not something that which we enjoy. Not to focus on ourselves. If our child finds it too hot Shabbos afternoon to go out with a hat and jacket, do we want him to go out for a hat and jacket because it's good for his chinuch? Or do we want him to go out for the hat and jacket because it's aesthetically pleasing? It's showroom business. It's externals. Whatever it is, whenever it comes to the Shmiras HaMitzvahs and Shmiras HaTorah, keeping the mitzvahs and keeping the Torah, we've got to focus on what's important in order to be able to enjoy them. If we're going to get in fights with our children over things which are so not important in the long term, things which in the long term they will come to the realization themselves what is going to be important and what's not going to be important, then we can't let that get in the way of enjoying our children. We need to put those things aside, make something special about every Shabbos, about every Yom Tov, and through that we can relate to our children. Shabbos is such a beautiful time. In the week, we're so busy with phones, with all the different things that we have on, all the pressures that we have. On Shabbos is a time to relax and sit back. And do you know what it means to just sit on the couch with your children and enjoy them? Not pressurizing them about what did you learn in school this week and forbearing them. There's time for that as well. But to just sit on the couch and relax with them. Just have your arm around them and talk about what they want to talk about. Let's listen to our children. Let's enjoy just sitting, relaxing with those children. And you'll see how much that will mean to them in the long run. How special Shabbos will become to them, because that will be the time where they remember that warm, homey feeling, where they snuggled up to their parents on the couch and were able to just be who they are. I'd like to just finish off with a beautiful story, which I read a number of years ago, and I think it's worth repeating. There was a man called Jack Phillips. Jack Phillips was a multimillionaire. He was the owner of oil companies, and him and his wife were very, very successful. He gave lots of tzedakahs. He gave scholarship funds to his children's schools. And he was coming up to his 60th birthday. The year before, he bought himself a luxurious yacht. This year, for his 60th, he wanted to do something special. He wanted the entire family to gather together in his Californian home. So he calls up his children. He tells them, make sure January the 27th, you're going to be at the home, at the ranch in California, at the mansion in California. I want you there. We're having a party for my 60th birthday. It's going to be a beautiful Shabbos. I want you to be there. No excuse is good enough. If you need a housekeeper, get a housekeeper. All expenses paid. My travel agent is booking you all tickets. He then went on the phone and called his grandchildren, who are obviously easier to convince than his actual children. He told his grandchildren, you're coming over. We're going to be meeting in the California mansion. We're going to be having a beautiful birthday party. And so the preparations steam ahead at full speed. And Jack is delighted. He's semi-retired, but he finds enough time every day to call the party planner a few times a day to make sure everything is going to be in place for this beautiful, beautiful Shabbaton, this beautiful birthday Shabbos. The children, meanwhile, get on the phone together and they're discussing what we need to buy a special birthday present for our father. Obviously, he's our beloved father. This is a special occasion. What can we buy him? They discuss buying him diamond cufflinks. He's got more cufflinks than he's got shirts. Buying him a candelabra, we got that last year. Buying a piece of jewelry for mum, it's not mum's birthday. They couldn't think what to do. And they call up their mother and they say to the mother, what should we give dad for his birthday? And she says, listen, call dad. And they remembered, yeah, their dad doesn't like surprises. So they call up their father. They call the office, all the children are on the phone together, and they call the secretary, and the secretary says, who's calling? Do you have an appointment? They say it's his children. Jack gets on the phone. He's so touched that his children are on the other end of the phone, and they say to him, Dad, thank you for putting on this beautiful Shabbos for us, but we really want to know, what can we buy you for your birthday? So he thinks for a moment, and he says to his children, I want to tell you something. There's something that I've wanted for 50 years. So his children are like, oh yeah? And he tells them like this, it's not going to cost you much money, but it might be very difficult to get hold of. His children are all ears, and Jack tells them his story. Because you might be very surprised about what I'm going to tell you. But 50 years ago, I was a child living in the Bronx in a very, very poor area. We had no money. We lived in New York. And my parents worked 14-hour shifts in a bakery. I was an only child. We had no extended family. And I was in public school, and we finished school 2:30 every afternoon, and I used to hang out with the delinquents on the street, and I was by no stretch of the imagination a good kid. In fact, I was a terror. Mr. Jason, the principal of the school, really didn't like me, and I loved to cause trouble for him. I would sit at home thinking, what can I do to make misery in school the next day? Matters came to a head when one day I knew the janitor had a day off, the caretaker had a day off. I took a wrench and I turned off the water supply to the public school. It came to break time, and all chaos broke loose. Children went to the bathrooms. There was no water to flush the toilets. The cook couldn't finish cooking the lunches because there was no water. There was no janitor in school to repair the problem. Nobody knew how to do it. Mr. Jason had to send the entire school home. I was delighted. The biggest chaos I'd caused. And I go home feeling really, really good to myself, really good about myself. Suddenly the phone rings in the house and there's no caller ID. I pick up the phone and I hear, is that the Phillips residence? And I recognize that voice. This is Mr. Jason. So I put on a voice, says Jack. I put on a voice and I say, sorry, they moved. So he goes, do you have a forwarding number? No, they didn't leave any details. And suddenly Mr. Jason claps at me and he says to me, you're in so much trouble. If you're not back in this school in 10 minutes, you're the one who turned off that water. He can't get out of it. He tries to play a dummy, but he can't get out of it. And he goes off to school knowing that he's going to be in serious trouble. But his heart drops down when he comes into the principal's office and he sees his parents standing there. And the parents go to him, Jack, come on, you're in so much trouble, please. And Mr. Jason says, I'm suspending you from school for a week. And before you're going to be allowed to take part in any other lessons, you're going to have to go and see the school psychologist, Dr. Nadoff. You can imagine, says Jack to his children, I had to stay out of school for a week and I planned schemes how to get back at Mr. Jason. I came back the day I was allowed back and I had to spend a 2-hour session with Dr. Nadoff before I was allowed to come to school the next day. So I go into Dr. Nadoff's office and he does a 2-hour assessment on me and he asks me many inane questions about whether I prefer to bunk off school or go and visit people in an old age home. And I answered all the questions very, very arrogantly. And I went home. I came home and I found my parents were packing up all their bags. They were packing up the whole house into boxes. And I said, Mom, Dad, what's going on? So they said, we're moving to Chicago. Dad's got a better job offer in Chicago and Mum's going to be a stay-at-home mum. She's going to be able to look after you. And with my friends helped. We packed up, the movers came, and we went on the 24-hour trip that it took in those days to go to Chicago. On that 24-hour trip, I had a lot of time to look back over my life and realize my parents are picking themselves up for me because they believe in me. They're taking me to a better place. I'm going to get my life in order. And from there, my life went up. I became fully religious. My parents became fully religious. My father succeeded in the company, the oil company he was working in, eventually buying the firm and becoming the multi-millionaire that made us the millionaires that we are today. The rest is history, he says. But children, he says, I want you to get for me for my birthday that report from Dr. Nadoff. We left before we could get that report. I want you to try and get me that report. Children hang up, they've got a job to do. They place a phone call to the public school. Secretary's not really interested till they offer them money. Somebody goes down to the school archives, they search through the boxes there, they find the report, they mail it off to the children, and they come to the weekend in January in a Californian mansion. It's such a beautiful Shabbos, works out better than could be expected. And the highlight is a birthday party on Sunday afternoon. They have a huge barbecue. They have a beautiful, beautiful time. And then Jack gets up to speak. He's going to speak to his children and his grandchildren. He's surrounded by all his loved ones. And just before he speaks, his children come over to him and say to him, Dad, we have a present for you. And they give him a huge wrapped gift box. Jack tears off the wrapping paper and all the grandchildren are looking to see what have they bought. And he takes out a sheaf of yellowing papers. He smiles and he looks at the papers and he reads through them. And then he gets up to speak and he says, I want you to know that I paid a speechwriter to make a beautiful speech, but I'm going to scrap that speech. I'm going to tell you something from me so many years ago when I was a delinquent child. And he reads, based from Dr. Nadoff, based on my 2-hour study, my opinion is that Jack Phillips is mentally retarded. He will never be able to acclimatize to a normal environment or be successful at a job. I recommend that he be committed to an institution for mentally handicapped young adults. He turns to his children and he writes, I have to thank Hashem that my parents picked up and left for Chicago before that report came home. I was sure when I asked you to get this report, if it would be something that would have inspired me to become a better person. But instead, they didn't see the long-term goal. He wrote utter rubbish, as we can see today, that Baruch Hashem, I'm such a successful person. Because we have to live above the labels that people give us. We have to live above all those difficulties and those we have to go above that. And he says to his children, you have to reach for the sky. And if you only end up with a handful of stars, that's okay, as long as you reach for the sky. So it should help us to see the eternal potential of our teenagers. We should to be able to see past all the turmoil and all the difficultness and the mess on the factory floor, like we said. And more than anything, we should be davening to Hashem that we can light up the eyes of our children and bring forth that light. Enjoy a warm and close relationship with them as we support them through the most difficult stage of their journeys. There are a few questions. I know that we probably run over time. Bang on time. There are a couple of questions which I'm happy to look at now. I don't know if we'll be able to answer them fully now, but next week it is a question and answer session. But ideally, if you can send in the questions beforehand, the earlier the questions come in, I know we won't be able to cover all the questions, but the questions that the earlier they come in, the more chance we have of being able to answer them. The email address to send the questions to is ay@darcheitorah.co.uk. That's ay@darcheitorah.co.uk. That's the where to send the questions to. I have a few questions over here. I'd like to try and answer them. My online gaming and YouTube videos. I simply feel I'm the wrong person, the wrong generation to play these games. So that's a question which gets asked often, and yes, you need to read up. It's you might be in the wrong generation. We're all in the wrong generation because the generation that they're in nowadays is not something we could have ever dreamed of. Baruch Hashem, we're in a generation where Google's around. Google the YouTube videos, Google the games, and be the first person to stick that thumb up, to give that like to his YouTube videos. And you want to be sharing those with him because you don't want him to be going off into a place where he's doing YouTube videos and getting the likes and the appreciation from people other than you. We need to be our children's biggest fan. And one of the ways of connecting with them, because they're gaming so much. I spoke to a boy who told me he gamed for, his record was 12 hours solid. And there's other parents who gamed for, there's other children who've gamed for longer. So yeah, you need to be there with him. That's the short answer. You need to be there with him to be able to like his YouTube videos, be a subscriber to his channel, and show an interest in those games. Do what Shlomo Freifeld did. Look up the subject beforehand. Look up, I didn't say the story of Shlomo Freifeld, but look up, Google what game, enjoy those games with him and enjoy his videos. Be his biggest fan. The next question which came up was, Shabbos has become challenging since lockdown. It was fine when everyone was locked down. Right, so a mother's written to me that Shabbos has become very challenging because the son wants to go out with his friends and be in the house because it's raining, the weather's not good here at the moment, and it's illegal and unsafe to do so. And you worry that this is leading him to dislike Shabbos. That's a big issue. It is a big issue, and I don't know how old the child is, so I'm not sure who it is, but if whoever's asking the question, I'm happy to answer that in private probably. It's probably better because I need some more details. My phone number is 07730 748 400, and that can be used to send in questions as well. If you want to be in touch, I will try and answer that question privately. The session has been recorded, and it will be sent out. And my email address, and I put a number there as well. Now. Okay, does anyone else have any questions? If anyone wants to send in a question, they can write it through. Someone's raised their hand, yeah. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you do if you have a teenager who puts themselves in their room for being upset with their parents, and they lock themselves in the room for hours on end, and afterwards come down and say that they were waiting for their parent to come to them to tell them to come down?
So it's a good question. Is there a simple answer to that? The answer probably is, yeah, if your child's telling you, this is what I want you to come to me, I want to hear from you, I want that connection with you. It's his way perhaps of saying, I'm embarrassed of what I've done and I need that connection to know that you're there for me. He comes down, if he's spending hours in his room, it's really, really not healthy. And if you're not going up to him to see if everything's okay, is there a reason you don't want to go up and see how he's doing?
No, they were upset. It was Shabbos, and we were eating a meal, and they were upstairs because they got upset with what one of their parents had said to them.
Right. Yeah, so definitely...
So you go halfway upstairs and you call them, and they just ignore. I'm expecting you to come all the way there.
Yeah, they might expect that, and that's what they really need. Maybe they just want you to come up and put your arm around them and say, I'm so sorry you feel like that. Don't need to necessarily apologize for what you've said, unless it has been something wrong, which you might have said. But to put your arm around them and say, I'm so sorry you feel like this. I really am. It's okay. I didn't mean to make you feel like that. And is there anything, what's bothering you? And keep that open relationship, because if it's just he's going to spend hours in his room, it's really, really unhealthy. So it is, you're gaining much more in the long term by going up there. After a while, let him settle down a little bit and going up there and saying, I'm so sorry that you feel like that. How can I make things better? I'm happy to discuss it in more detail if you want to take my number, and you're welcome to call.
Okay, could you just repeat your number then, please? Because I didn't take it down when you said it before.
Okay, it's 07730.
07730, yeah.
748.
Yeah.
400.
Thank you so much.
So a parent just asked if, since a husband enjoys reading from a Sefer at the Shabbos table and it's for the teenagers to listen, some don't like it or bored and frustrated, and the younger ones are not included. And we talked about bringing it down to include the younger ones, but sometimes my husband thinks that we should raise them up to our level, should try to listen in silence and take some in. Is this good? Not really, no, because they're just going to resent the Shabbos table. They're going to resent whatever you gain by teaching them in that sefer is going to be lost by the resentment they're going to feel. So, maybe talk about the parasha, maybe do a quiz of general knowledge, find a general knowledge book in Jewish history on Jewish halacha or anything like that, and try and make something fun for them, something which is on their level. But it's definitely not worth trying to raise their level, definitely not on Shabbos. Raising the level you can try and leave to the schools to do, but at home it should be something which is enjoyable and something which creates no resentment. That's really important. Kids are so bored, and no matter what is suggested, they only want to watch videos, age 9. Okay, that's a big, that probably is a question for next week, to deal with next week. It's a big, and it can't be handled told no. So that, again, we need more information on exactly what's going on with that child. So the asker of that question, if they want to reach out privately, I'll try and answer that in more detail when I have some more details about the actual situation. There's no simple answer. Every situation depends on who the child is and how we can answer that. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you all for joining, and Mitzvah Shem next week we will continue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so.
Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Korach.
Oh, it's gone.
Okay.